What if a Space Marine fought in Vietnam? In 1968, the jungle swallowed 12 Marines whole. What crawled out wasn't human anymore. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole leads his patrol through triple canopy forest so dense the sun becomes a rumor. Sweat drips down faces painted green and black. Boots sink into mud that smells like rot. The Vietnamese jungle doesn't just surround these men. It suffocates them. 12 Marines, 20 clicks from the Cambodian border, hunting something that intelligence calls a VC superweapon. 3 platoons have vanished in this sector. No bodies recovered, no radio contact, just silence where American voices used to be. Cole raises a fist. The patrol freezes. Ahead, through a gap in the vegetation, stone gleams where no stone should exist. The temple doesn't belong here. The architecture is wrong. Not Vietnamese. Not anything Cole recognizes from his years in Asia. Black stone covered in symbols that make his eyes water when he stares too long. Cold radiates from the structure despite 90-degree heat. Cold that settles in bones and refuses to leave. Private First Class Danny Reyes crosses himself. The Catholic boy from Texas has prayed every day since arriving in country. Something about this place makes him pray harder. Inside the temple, Cole finds the bodies. American and NVA soldiers lying together, enemies in death as they were in life. But these men didn't kill each other. Something tore them apart. Something with claws larger than any animal in these jungles. Something strong enough to rip a man in half while his rifle remained unfired. A 2-headed eagle sigil marks the walls. None of Cole's men recognize it. At the temple's heart, they find the source. A figure towers in the darkness, 9 feet tall, encased in armor so massive it seems impossible for any human to wear. Black ceramite covered in centuries of jungle growth. Vines wrap around limbs thick as tree trunks. The armor's surface bears scars from weapons that don't exist. Damage from battles fought in places these Marines cannot imagine. The eyes are dark. The chest doesn't move. The figure appears dead. A relic from some forgotten age. A monument to a war no one remembers. Reyes steps forward for a closer look. His boot catches a root. His hand shoots out for balance and finds the figure's gauntlet. Blood wells from his palm where ancient metal cuts flesh. Human blood touches ceramite for the first time in 10,000 years. The jungle goes silent. No birds, no insects, no wind through leaves. Nothing. Red eyes ignite in the darkness. Stone cracks beneath shifting weight. Vines tear like wet paper. The figure moves with purpose, rising from its ancient slumber, and 12 Marines stumble backward, with rifles raised against something their bullets cannot stop. Brother Sergeant Calius of the Iron Hands Space Marine Chapter wakes to confusion. His last memory is battle against orc forces, a warp storm tearing reality apart, the sensation of being ripped across dimensions and cast into an endless void. Now he stands in a jungle that smells wrong, surrounded by small humans in strange uniforms. Primitive weapons pointed at his chest. They speak a bastardized version of Low Gothic he can barely comprehend. His chronometer cross-references with stellar positions. The data returns impossible. 38,000 years backward. Before unity. Before the Emperor revealed himself. Before everything Calius knows will exist. He stands on holy terra itself, in an age of strife that predates the strife his chapter knows. These humans war amongst themselves with chemical propellant weapons over ideology and territory. Conflicts that seem meaningless by his standards. Yet, they are still human. Still his to protect by oaths sworn to an emperor who will not be born for millennia. Cole's patrol has awakened something that doesn't belong in this century, this planet, or this reality. And Callias, warrior of the Imperium, has found himself stranded in humanity's past with no way home, no brothers at his side, and a single burning purpose that transcends time itself. Protect humanity. Continue the crusade. Endure. The Vietnam War just gained a visitor from mankind's darkest future. Safeties clicked off in the humid air, a dozen M16s finding their aim on the giant's chest. The sound was a chorus of tiny, useless defiance. The 9-foot warrior stood motionless, his crimson eyes scanning the patrol with an unnerving, analytical calm. Each Marine, his stance, his weapons readiness, all were catalogued and assessed in microseconds. Primitive ballistic weapons, unaugmented humans. Their heart rates were elevated, pupils dilated in fear, yet they maintained fire discipline. They did not break. They did not run. Warriors, then. Perhaps some lost regiment of the Imperial Army on a feral world long forgotten. From the vox grill of his helmet, a voice resonated, a language of sharp, classical authority that no one understood. High Gothic. Silence. The language shifted, becoming rougher, more guttural, the low Gothic of 100,000 battlefields. Still, he was met only with confused, terrified stares. "Hold your fire!" Staff Sergeant Cole's voice cut through the tension, low and steady. Every man flinched, but no one lowered their weapon. "I said, hold your goddamn fire!" Cole, a veteran who'd seen a dead man walk in the snows of Korea, lowered his own rifle first. He made a slow, deliberate gesture for his men to do the same. Something in the giant's posture, the disciplined economy of movement, the constant, methodical scanning for threats, wasn't just a monster. It was a soldier. "What the hell is it, Sarge?" someone whispered. "Quiet," Cole ordered. It was Lance Corporal James Okonkwo who broke the impasse. The patrol's radio man, a quiet intellectual who'd been studying for the seminary before his draft number came up, leaned forward. His high school Latin, honed by years of reading scripture, caught fragments of the giant's speech. The words were corrupted, evolved beyond recognition, but the roots were there. Ancient, dead, but there. "Sarge," Okonkwo said, his voice trembling with academic excitement more than fear. I think I can talk to him." What followed was an hour of painstaking, frustrating effort. Okonkwo would say a word in Latin: terra, for earth; bellum, for war; homo, for man. Helios, his mind processing the linguistic drift over millennia, would respond in his own tongue. Slowly, through repetition and gesture, a bridge of understanding formed across 38,000 years of history. Helios learned he was on a world its inhabitants called Earth. The low Gothic translation, however, was unmistakable. Terra. The name hit his twin hearts like a power maul. Holy Terra. He was home. But when he asked of the Emperor, of the Great Crusade, of the Imperium of Man, he received only blank stares. Okonkwo, piecing together the temporal questions, pointed to the stars. He drew constellations in the dirt. Helios's internal chronometer, cross-referencing the stellar drift, delivered a verdict so impossible it bordered on heresy. He had not only been cast across the galaxy, he had been thrown backward through time. 38,000 years. Before unity. Before the Emperor walked among men. Before everything. For a son of the Iron Hands, for whom doubt is a terminal weakness, the revelation was a psychic shock. He stood on the throne world itself, but in an age of ignorance and strife. He could hear the distant crump of artillery, See the contrails of primitive aircraft. Humans killing humans. A pointless internecine conflict on the one world that should have been united above all others. And yet, they were still human. By the oaths he swore to an emperor who was not yet a god, not yet a corpse, not yet anything but a distant historical promise. They were his to protect. The Iron Hand's pragmatism took hold. The mission adapts. The flesh is weak. He would protect humanity here. He would learn what he could of this strange, savage past, and he would find a way back to his own time. These small, fragile warriors, these United States Marines, had faced him without breaking. They would serve. They would be his temporary squad. The Marines watched him, their minds reeling. Cole saw a weapon, an asset beyond any general's wildest dream. Reyes, the young Catholic, clutched the cross around his neck, unsure if he was witnessing a miracle or the coming of a demon. Okonkwo burned with a scholar's impossible questions about the future. The others just wanted to survive the night, and they knew, with absolute certainty, that their odds had just improved. Callias turned and strode back into the temple's darkness. He returned moments later, his ancient arsenal in hand. A bolt pistol, its casing scarred, with only 17 rounds remaining in its magazine. A chainsword, its teeth chipped, its motor sputtering with a weak, rattling growl. His ceramite armor, scored and pitted, but fully functional. He looked at the 12 men who had awakened him from his long sleep. His gaze settled on Cole, then on Okonkwo. His voice, filtered through the vox, was hard as iron. Okonkwo translated, his own voice hushed with awe. "Show me your enemy." The patrol's exfiltration began as a tense, silent march. 20 clicks to Firebase Cherokee. 20 kilometers of suffocating jungle that felt like it was actively trying to kill them. The air was a wet blanket, thick with the smell of decay and the drone of insects that had not yet learned to fear their new companion. For 3 hours, they moved in a staggered column. Cole at the point, Callias, a looming shadow in the center of the formation. The Space Marine moved with a silence that defied his bulk, his massive boots finding purchase on the slick mud without a sound. The Marines, however, were still clumsy, still loud, their gear rattling, their breathing ragged in the heat. Then the world exploded. A wall of sound and lead erupted from their left flank. The distinctive, high-pitched chatter of AK-47s ripped through the trees, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a DSHK heavy machine gun. The jungle canopy shredded, raining leaves and splintered wood. Private Morrison, barely 19, was caught in the first burst. He was dead before his helmet hit the ground. "Contact left! Get down!" Cole screamed, hitting the dirt as bullets snapped inches above his head. The patrol returned fire, M16s barking a panicked, desperate response. But it was useless. They had walked straight into a perfectly executed L-shaped kill zone. 50 NVA regulars, dug into concealed positions, had them pinned. The heavy machine gun, positioned at the apex of the L, raked their line, chewing up the earth and trees they used for cover. This was it. This was how patrols were erased from the map. Except this patrol had Callias. For a single, agonizing second, the Space Marine stood motionless as the ambush raged around him. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off his black ceramite armor, whining away into the jungle like angry hornets. His threat assessment concluded. Enemy concentration, high. Firepower, significant against unaugmented humans, negligible against Astartes plate. Threat to mission, absolute. Then he moved. To the Marines, it was as if a piece of the night had come alive. He was a blur of black armor, covering 30 meters of open ground in the time it took a man to breathe. The NVA soldiers saw a 9-foot demon charge out of the smoke, shrugging off their bullets as if they were rain. He didn't fire his bolt pistol. Its ammunition was a relic he could not replace. Instead, his right hand closed around the grip of his chainsword. He thumbed the activation rune. The sound that tore through the jungle was an obscenity. It was not the sound of combat. It was the sound of an abattoir. A high-pitched, grinding mechanical shriek that vibrated in the teeth and froze NVA soldiers mid-reload. It was the sound of nightmares made real. Callius tore through the ambush line in 11 seconds. The chainsword, a weapon designed to rip through orc flesh and alien carapaces, met unarmored human bodies with sickening efficiency. He didn't swing it like a sword. He used it like a harvesting tool. The heavy machine gun nest swiveled to track him, but it was too slow. Callius reached it, ignored the frantic crew, and simply grabbed the half-ton gun mount. With a grunt of effort that was more annoyance than exertion, he lifted the entire emplacement, gun, sandbags, and 2 terrified soldiers, and hurled it into the trees with the force of a catapult. Silence fell, broken only by the dripping of blood and the whimpering of the dying. 43 North Vietnamese soldiers lay in pieces. 7, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed, had dropped their weapons and fled screaming into the jungle. Callius let them go. Fear was a weapon, and he had just armed it. The surviving Marines slowly rose from the mud, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Several of them retched, turning away from the carnage. Reyes was on his knees, his hands clasped, whispering a prayer. Cole, his face a mask of stone, walked forward. Callius stood in the center of the massacre, methodically wiping gore from the teeth of his chainsword with a piece of scavenged cloth. The weapon sputtered and died, its motor finally giving out. Cole stopped a few feet away. The stench of blood was overwhelming. "What? What are you?" he asked, his voice rough. Callius looked up, his red eye lenses fixed on the sergeant. Okonkwo, shaking, stepped forward to translate the reply that crackled from the Vox grill. "I am what humanity becomes when it must survive the galaxy." He said it without pride, without malice. It was a simple statement of fact, as cold and hard as his armor. The journey to Firebase Cherokee continued, but the patrol was different. Callius studied the bodies of the enemy, humans, unaugmented, fighting other humans with primitive chemical propellant weapons. A meaningless conflict over ideology and territory. Yet, his gaze fell on his own squad differently now. They had held their ground. They had fought with courage, despite their fragility. None had broken when Morrison fell. The Iron Hands respected endurance above all else. As they marched, he began to teach them. A sharp, unfamiliar hand signal to indicate an enemy sniper. A gesture to shift their formation into an overlapping field of fire. He would physically stop a Marine, adjust his footing, and point to a better line of sight. They were no longer just a Marine patrol. They were becoming something else, something deadlier, something forged in the image of a future they could never comprehend. Firebase Cherokee was a boil on the face of the jungle, a scarred hilltop of red clay, sandbags, and razor wire. It was home to 200 American soldiers, a battery of 105mm howitzers, and a commanding officer who thought he had seen everything the world had to offer. He was wrong. When Cole's patrol stumbled out of the tree line, the entire base went on high alert. It wasn't the ragged state of the Marines that did it. It was the thing walking with them. Sirens blared. Men scrambled for cover, raising M16s at the 9-foot giant in blackened, battle-scarred armor. A dozen machine gun nests swiveled to aim at its chest. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire! This is Staff Sergeant Cole, 1st Marines! We're friendlies, goddammit!" Cole's voice, raw and desperate, barely cut through the chaos. He and his men moved to surround Callius, making themselves a human shield, their own dog tags and uniforms a desperate plea against a catastrophic mistake. From a command bunker emerged Colonel Harold West, a man whose face was a roadmap of 30 years of service, from the shores of Incheon to the Ia Drang Valley. He stared, his cigarillo falling from his lips, at the impossible figure that had emerged from his jungle. He saw the American uniforms around it, saw their discipline, and made the call that saved everyone's lives. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice tight. "Let them in." The debriefing took place in a command bunker that felt absurdly small. Callius had to stoop to enter, his armored form filling the space, his shadow swallowing the colonel's desk. Colonel West, a man pragmatic enough to have survived 3 wars, sat opposite him, trying to reconcile the reports of the ambush with the creature sitting before him. Through Lance Corporal Okonkwo's halting and imperfect translation, Callius explained. He spoke of being a warrior from a future humanity, of a war that spanned the stars. He spoke of a dimension used for travel, the warp, a concept that West's mind simply refused to process. He concluded that he was lost, without a way home, and without allegiance to any nation of this forgotten era. He offered only one thing: he would kill the enemies of humanity. And on this world, in this place, that meant the men these soldiers were fighting. West leaned back, took a long drag from a new cigarillo, and blew a stream of smoke toward the bunker's low ceiling. He had reports of 43 enemy KIA and 1 American casualty. He had a patrol that should have been wiped out standing before him. He had a living, breathing impossibility offering to fight for his side. The how and the why were luxuries he couldn't afford. "All right," West said, his voice flat. "I accept." Callius then requested tactical information. Maps of the region, enemy dispositions, intelligence on supply routes and command structures. In the Tactical Operations Center, West's intelligence officers watched in stunned silence as the giant processed a year's worth of data in under an hour. His armored fingers traced lines on the maps, his red eye lenses glowing faintly. He began to speak, Okonkwo struggling to keep up. He pointed out vulnerabilities in the Ho Chi Minh Trail based on seasonal rainfall patterns that the analysts had missed. He suggested new artillery fire missions designed not just for destruction but for psychological terror, coordinating barrages to mimic natural phenomena before a strike. He predicted NVA troop movements with chilling accuracy. West realized he wasn't dealing with a brute. He was dealing with a strategic mind forged across millennia of unending war. That evening, West sent a series of coded messages to MACV headquarters in Saigon. He couldn't explain what he had. He didn't try. He only promised results. An agreement was struck. Callius would operate exclusively with Cole's patrol, now unofficially designated Ghost Squad. They would be given priority for intelligence and support, tasked with missions beyond the scope of normal operations. In exchange, Callius asked for 3 things: unfiltered access to all enemy intelligence, complete operational freedom in the field, and any captured or damaged technological equipment he could study and adapt. West agreed to it all. He had no other choice. In 3 days, Ghost Squad would undertake its first sanctioned mission. The target, a labyrinthine tunnel complex west of Saigon, known as Cu Chi. It was the most formidable NVA stronghold in the south. More importantly, Recent intelligence intercepts suggested that the enemy had found something else in the ruins of that ancient temple. Something Callias knew he had to find and destroy before this world's petty war became something far, far worse. The Kuchi Tunnel Complex was a cancer beneath the earth. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a subterranean city of defiance where American soldiers, the tunnel rats, went in and often didn't come out. For Ghost Squad, the mission was simple: penetrate, assess, and neutralize. But for Callias, the challenge was physical. The entrances were built for men, not demigods. He stood before a camouflaged trapdoor, a hole no wider than his leg. He did not hesitate. Iron hands are masters of adaptation. From the firebase, he had scavenged shaped charges, marveling at their crude but effective design. He placed them not with brute force, but with the precision of a master artisan, laying them against a section of packed earth away from the known entrances. The resulting explosion was a muffled, focused thump, not a roar. It didn't create a crater, it carved a doorway. The Marines followed him into a darkness that felt absolute. The humid air immediately became thick, cloying, smelling of damp clay, sweat, and something else, something ancient and sterile, like a long-sealed tomb. Flashlight beams cut feeble paths, swallowed by the oppressive blackness just a few feet ahead. Every corner promised a booby trap. Every shadow could hide an enemy. They found the enemy's work soon enough. The NVA had been digging, expanding their network, but then the man-made tunnels changed. The rough, dirt-packed walls gave way to smooth, sweeping curves of a material that wasn't stone. It was pale, almost bone-like, and seemed to hum with a silent energy that made the fillings in the Marine's teeth ache. Callias stopped, his hand tracing the alien architecture. Okonkwo heard him whisper a single word, a guttural sound of dawning horror. Eldari. The passages, clearly not of human or Vietnamese make, connected the crude tunnel network to something far older. Callias understood with sickening clarity. This world, this holy terra of the past, had been visited. The temple on the surface was merely the capstone of a vast Xenos installation. The artifact that had pulled him across time and space was a translocation device, a webway beacon left dormant for millennia, and the NVA, in their desperate digging, had stumbled upon it and woken it up. Deeper in, they found the proof. NVA soldiers lay scattered in a large, circular chamber. They weren't shot, stabbed, or blown apart. They were simply dead, their bodies untouched, their faces frozen in masks of silent, soul-deep terror. Their rifles lay beside them, unfired. Whatever killed them, it wasn't a thing you could shoot. Then the Marines saw them. 4 figures, tall and slender, moved from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. They were made of the same pale wraith bone as the walls, walking with an unnatural grace. They had no faces, only smooth, helmeted heads, and they carried immense cannons that glowed with an internal, wicked light. They were Wraithguard, ancient, soulless automatons left to guard this place. The rift that pulled Callias through had pulled them through as well. "Stay back," Callias commanded, his voice a low growl that needed no translation. "This is not your war." He advanced alone, his bolt pistol raised. This was not a fight for men with chemical propellant rifles. The battle was a maelstrom of violence in the suffocating dark. The roar of Callias's bolt pistol was deafening, each round a miniature explosion that cracked and splintered the wraithbone constructs. But they did not stop. One raised its cannon, and a beam of pure distortion lashed out. Callias dodged, the beam striking the wall behind him. which simply ceased to exist. He activated his chainsword, its dying motor screaming in protest as he tore into one of the constructs, ripping it apart before the motor finally seized with a final grinding shriek. He destroyed a second with 2 point-blank bolt rounds. He had 10 left, but the Marines disobeyed. Seeing their protector embattled, Sergeant Williams and Private Chen broke from cover, their M16s chattering uselessly, bullets sparking off the unfeeling constructs. It was an act of impossible, suicidal bravery. One of the Wraith Guard turned, its movements fluid and unhurried. It simply walked through Sergeant Williams. For a moment, Williams stood frozen, his rifle falling from his hands. Then the light in his eyes vanished, his soul torn free. He crumpled to the ground, an empty vessel. As the construct turned toward Chen, Kaelius roared, a sound of pure fury, and charged. He slammed his body into the Wraith Guard, driving it back, and with his bare hands tore its head from its shoulders. He dispatched the final one with a precise shot to its power core, expending another precious bolt round. Silence fell. Kaelius stood over the broken shells of the Xenos machines, his armor scored, his chainsword ruined. He looked at the body of Sergeant Williams. He looked at the trembling, weeping Private Chen, whom he had just saved. He looked at the terrified faces of the other Marines who had held their ground against a nightmare. A cold, logical calculation shifted in the core of his being. They were not tools. They were not assets. Their flesh was weak, their courage was foolish, and their loyalty was absolute. They were brothers. He stood in the ruin of the Xenos chamber, the air still tasting of ozone and non-existence. Ignoring the shattered bodies of his men and the broken shells of the constructs, Kaelius approached the source of the disturbance. It was a gateway, an arch of flowing wraithbone that hummed with a deep internal music, a webway portal, a flicker of something akin to hope, a cold and unfamiliar emotion sparked within him. A way home. He reached out with his armor's diagnostic tools, his mind already processing stellar drift, temporal displacement, and energy fluctuations. The hope died as quickly as it had been born. The device was damaged, its matrix fractured by his own violent arrival. The coordinates were a chaotic scramble of cosmic noise. Activating it would be a gamble of insane odds. It could tear a new hole in reality, fling him into the heart of a star, or simply atomize him. Worse, leaving it active was an invitation. The rift was a wound in the fabric of space-time, and it was bleeding. More things could come through. He could not use it. He dared not destroy it, fearing the resulting warp breach could swallow this entire region of Terra. The Iron Hand's logic was brutal and absolute. He could only do one thing: guard it. He found Cole near the new entrance, his face grim as he supervised the recovery of Sergeant Williams's body. Through the weary translation of Lance Corporal Okonkwo, Kaelius explained his decision. He would remain. This place, this tear in reality, was now his post. His war was no longer against the human soldiers of the North. It was against the abyss itself. Cole listened, his expression unreadable in the gloom. The Marine sergeant, who had seen a 9-foot giant tear through an ambush and battle monsters from another world, simply nodded. He had grown to accept the impossible. But he asked a question born of his own finite experience with conflict. What about when this war ends? The question gave Kaelius pause. He processed it, searching for context in his millennia of ingrained doctrine. Wars. Ended? The long night had ended, yes, but only to give way to the Great Crusade. The crusade had ended, only to be replaced by the Horus Heresy. The heresy had never truly ended, its shadow stretching into a 10,000-year war against the traitor, the mutant, the Xenos. The Imperium's wars were eternal. They were a state of being. He admitted, in halting, broken phrases, that he did not have an answer. Cole let out a short, humorless laugh. He clapped a hand on Okonkwo's shoulder, but his eyes were on the giant. "Tell him not to worry," Cole said, his voice raspy with dust and grief. "Humanity always finds another one." Over the following months, the war in their sector changed. The legend of Ghost Squad and its spectral guardian solidified into myth. In American fire bases, soldiers spoke in hushed tones of Cole's monster, an experimental super soldier in black armor that couldn't be killed. They traded third-hand stories of it lifting machine gun nests, of it walking through artillery strikes, a guardian angel forged from steel and fury. For the NVA and Viet Cong, the stories were darker. They spoke of the Ma Gung, the jungle ghost, a demon the Americans had summoned from hell. They said it moved without sound, that bullets turned to dust against its skin, and that it left a strange two-headed eagle sigil at the sites of its massacres. In Hanoi and Washington, intelligence analysts grew frantic. Colonel West became a master of bureaucratic warfare, burying reports, classifying missions into oblivion, and feeding false leads to investigators from both sides. But the stories escaped containment. They were carried by wounded men on medevac choppers and whispered by terrified prisoners in interrogation cells. In Moscow and Beijing, where the Cold War was a game of grand strategy, uncomfortable questions were being asked. What, exactly, had the Americans found in that jungle? The strategic impact was undeniable. Guided by Callius's transhuman tactical acumen, Ghost Squad became a scalpel. Ambushes they were meant to walk into were reversed with terrifying precision. Convoys on the Ho Chi Minh Trail vanished without a trace. High-ranking enemy officers were eliminated in bunkers they believed to be impenetrable. The body count for the NVA skyrocketed, while casualties in Cole's unit plummeted. The squad was reinforced with hand-picked volunteers, men who had seen enough to believe in the impossible. They became something new, a hybrid doctrine of 20th-century grit and 41st millennium warfare. They were no longer just a Marine patrol. They were the harbingers of a way of war this world would not properly understand for centuries. They only knew one thing. They were winning. The stories traveled far beyond the jungle. They became whispers in Saigon bars, coded intercepts in Langley, and finally, thick, unbelievable dossiers on a polished desk in the Lubyanka building. In Moscow, where the world was a chessboard of predictable moves, the reports of the Ma Gung Cetatrice, were an anomaly that could not be tolerated. The Americans had a ghost, a demon, something that broke the rules of conventional warfare. The KGB decided it was time to learn its name. They dispatched a team of their finest, Spetsnaz operators trained in counterinsurgency, military scientists with a portfolio of exotic weapons, and a woman named Yekaterina Volkov. She was their true weapon. A product of a program spoken of only in numbered rooms, Volkov was a telepath, a genuine psychic scalpel meant to dissect the minds of the state's enemies. From a secure location in North Vietnam, she was ordered to reach out and touch the mind of the American super soldier. She closed her eyes, her consciousness soaring over the jungle, a ghost in search of a ghost. She found him, a mind like a fortress of cold iron, radiating a power that felt ancient and vast. She pushed gently, expecting to find the thoughts of a man. Instead, the fortress gates blew open. For 3 seconds, she was submerged. She saw a galaxy burning, stars dying like embers. She felt the gaze of laughing gods of plague and perversion. She saw an emperor of gold and dust sitting on a throne of screaming machinery, his psychic light a beacon in an ocean of damnation. She felt the cold, hard certainty of a warrior who had faced this for 10,000 years and had not broken. Yekaterina Volkov screamed until the blood vessels in her eyes burst. Her handlers rushed in to find her thrashing, her nails digging into her own face. When they finally sedated her, she could only repeat a single chilling phrase over and over again. There is only war. The psychic intelligence was a failure, but the terror was not. The Soviet advisors, though dismissing her as a casualty of psychological strain, took her fragmented warnings to heart. The target was not merely durable, it was something else entirely. Bullets were useless. Therefore, they would not use bullets. Working with NVA engineers, they devised a new kind of trap. They found a valley, a natural funnel in the terrain, and spent 2 weeks rigging the mountainsides with hundreds of tons of explosives. They would not try to kill the ghost. They would bury it. A carefully fabricated piece of intelligence, a supposed high-level NVA command meeting, was leaked to American long-range reconnaissance. Ghost Squad took the bait. As Chelios and his Marines entered the valley, the jungle fell silent. Too silent. Chelios's enhanced senses registered the anomalies instantly. The scent of freshly disturbed earth, the faint hum of buried electrical detonators, the precise, unnatural placement of rockfalls. His internal chronometer marked the 2.3 seconds it took to analyze the trap's architecture. It was perfect. Kill zones were established to shred his human comrades, while the main charges were designed to bring the entire mountain down upon him. The first explosion was not the mountain, but a series of directional mines that tore through the squad's flanks. Marines screamed and fell, the air filled with shrapnel and dirt. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions. Chelios saw Cole dragging a wounded Reyes to cover. He saw Okonkwo returning fire, his face a mask of furious concentration. They were pinned. They would be annihilated. He had one option. It was not a choice for survival, but a calculation of loss. He raised his bolt pistol, aimed not at the enemy soldiers, but at the primary detonation charge high on the cliff face. He would trigger the avalanche himself. He would dictate the terms of his own entombment. The resulting roar was the sound of a world ending. The mountain did not just collapse, it disintegrated. Thousands of tons of rock, dirt, and jungle tore free and cascaded into the valley. The surviving Marines were thrown back by a concussive wave of air, their last sight of Chelios being a black silhouette against a wall of falling earth. Then he was gone. NVA forces swept the area, finding shattered trees, dead Americans, and a valley floor raised by 30 meters of rubble. The jungle ghost was gone. In Hanoi and Moscow, the news was met with quiet, triumphant relief. For 3 weeks, the war returned to normal. Ghost Squad, reduced to 7 men, fought on with a suicidal fury, honoring their fallen protector. They believed he was dead. They were wrong. Deep beneath the earth, crushed in a tomb of stone, a single red eye lens flickered to life. Chelios's multilung was recycling the thin pockets of air. His Susan membrane had plunged him into a state of metabolic hibernation, and his iron hands, tireless and methodical, had already begun to dig. 23 days after the mountain fell, the jungle had begun to reclaim the scar. A patrol of North Vietnamese soldiers moved cautiously along the ridge overlooking the valley of rubble. They were not looking for Americans. They were confirming a victory, walking ground that was once again theirs. Then the earth began to tremble. Not the deep, rolling shudder of an earthquake, but a localized, violent tremor, as if something immense were stirring in its sleep just beneath their feet. The soldiers froze, listening. The vibration centered on a mound of shattered rock and uprooted trees. Cracks spread across the dirt. With a sound like grinding continents, the ground itself heaved upward and split open. From the raw earth, a hand of black fused metal clawed its way into the humid air. Then another. And then the figure dragged itself from its own grave. It was not the pristine giant they had buried. The armor was a ruin, scored by thousands of tons of pressure, its surfaces gouged and warped. One shoulder pauldron was gone entirely, revealing a substructure of twisted plasteel. Mud and rock clung to it like a shroud. But it was alive. A single red eye lens glowed with cold, undiminished fury. Caelius had survived. He had subsisted on recycled air filtered through damaged systems, his body consuming its own waste products, his will an iron fortress against the crushing dark. The NVA soldiers did not scream. They did not fire. The sight was beyond the context of war. It was a religious terror. They dropped their rifles and fled, their minds shattered by the vision of a demon clawing its way back from hell. The legend of the jungle ghost died that day, replaced by the far more terrifying truth of the thing that could not be buried. Miles away, near Da Nang, the 7 survivors of Ghost Squad were pinned down in a sodden rice paddy. The war had gone back to being what it was, a meat grinder. Then, amidst the crackle of gunfire and frantic shouts, their radio hissed with a sound no one had heard in weeks. It was a distorted, gravelly voice, speaking a language only one of them understood. Lance Corporal Okonkwo scrambled for the handset, his hands shaking. The broken Latin was slow, deliberate, each word an effort. I am Caelius. I endure. Send coordinates. The reunion at the extraction point was silent. A slick descended into a clearing, and from the tree line, the ruined giant emerged. He moved with a stiff, pained gait, but he moved. Sergeant Cole, a man who hadn't shown an ounce of sentiment in 2 wars, walked forward and, without a word, wrapped his arms around the ceramite waist of the Space Marine. It was like hugging a broken statue. PFC Reyes fell to his knees, weeping openly, his hands clasped in prayer, crossing himself again and again. The squad was whole, but Caelius was not the same. 3 weeks alone in the crushing darkness, with nothing but his own thoughts and the cold furnace of his hatred, had burned away any remaining ambiguity. He would no longer simply participate in this petty, primitive conflict. He would end it. His way. The campaign that followed was not warfare. It was a systematic deconstruction of an entire army's will to fight. Caelius began planning operations of breathtaking audacity. Ghost Squad was no longer a reconnaissance unit. It was a scalpel, and Caelius wielded it with millennia of surgical precision. They struck command bunkers deep within North Vietnam, leaving entire general staffs dead in their chairs. They appeared on heavily guarded bridges moments before dawn, planting charges that shattered infrastructure for hundreds of miles. They walked into ammunition depots, past sentries who would later swear they saw nothing, and left them as blossoming fireballs against the night sky. And everywhere they went, Caelius left his mark. Burned into a concrete wall with a plasma cutter scavenged from a downed jet, painted in the blood of a high-ranking political officer, or simply carved into the earth with his iron hand. The Aquila, the 2-headed eagle of an Imperium that would not exist for 38,000 years. To the NVA, it became a symbol of inescapable doom. Soldiers who found it scrawled near their post would desert by morning. Entire companies surrendered at the mere rumor of its appearance. Hanoi, in desperation, issued standing orders. Any soldier caught speaking of the eagle demon would be executed. The orders failed. You cannot execute a nightmare that has already taken root in 1,000,000 minds. In Washington, the whispers were different. Analysts saw the North Vietnamese war effort collapsing in entire sectors for no logical reason. Certain men in shadowy corners of the Pentagon began to ask if their asset couldn't be used more decisively. Colonel West, his face grim, refused every request. He knew he wasn't commanding a weapon. He was barely maintaining a truce with a god of war, and he had no intention of finding out what would happen if he gave an order Callias chose to refuse. The systematic destruction of the NVA war machine had an effect no military strategist could have predicted. Callias's campaign of terror was so successful that it created a vacuum. Entire regions became no-go zones, abandoned by Hanoi's forces. Patrols that once scoured the jungle near the Cambodian border now refused to go within 20 clicks of the place where the eagle demon was first seen. The ancient temple, the source of it all, was left utterly alone. And in that silence, the wound in reality began to fester. The damaged Eldar device, which had torn Callias from his own time, was never stable. Without the constant, minor disturbances of human activity, its delicate energies began to decay chaotically. The rift it held open started to widen. This time it was not the clean, soulless constructs of the Eldar that slipped through. It was something else, something drawn to the psychic stench of 38,000 years of human conflict, all concentrated in this one small, bloody peninsula. Minor demons, formless things of raw emotion, the spawn of the warp, began to leak into the jungles of Vietnam. The land itself grew sick. Near the temple, the triple canopy jungle began to twist into shapes that defied biology. Banyan trees grew thorns of bone, their roots writhing like serpents. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and rot, and whispers slithered on the edge of hearing. An NVA reconnaissance squad, lost and desperate, stumbled into the corrupted zone. They vanished for 3 days. When a search party found them wandering a trail miles away, they were all alive, and they were all blind, their eyes milky white, their mouths open in a silent scream. Periodically, one of them would begin shrieking, not in Vietnamese, but in languages that had died before humanity first stood upright. When reports of the screaming patrol reached Firebase Cherokee, filtered through a network of informants, Callias recognized the symptoms instantly. He had seen this plague spread across 100 worlds. It was chaos, the great enemy, the primordial annihilator, present on Holy Terra, millennia before the Emperor would even begin his great crusade. In a single cold moment of clarity, the Vietnam War ceased to matter. It was a footnote, a trivial squabble between primitives. His true mission, the purpose for which he was forged in gene seed and fire, was here. He would not allow the ruinous powers to gain a foothold on this world. Not now, not ever. He gathered the last of Ghost Squad, Cole, Okonkwo, Reyes, and 4 others. He did not soften the truth. In his halting English, supplemented by Okonkwo's frantic translations, he described the enemy they now faced. He spoke not of military forces, but of gods. Gods of disease, of rage, of forbidden pleasure, of endless, scheming change. He told them of entities that fed on human suffering, that could wear a man's soul like a coat, and whose only goal was the enslavement or utter extinction of mankind. The rift in the temple, he explained, was a doorway. a way for hell to bleed into their world. The Marines listened, their faces pale in the lantern light of the bunker. Reyes, the Catholic boy, found his faith not shaken, but horribly affirmed. He clutched the melted rosary that still hung around his neck. Okonkwo, the intellectual, wrestled with a theological horror that dwarfed any battlefield fear. Cole, ever the pragmatist, simply lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his grim face. "So," he said, his voice flat, "how do we kill a god?" They all stood with him. They were his brothers. To the end. Their final mission was an assault on the temple itself. Chelius planned to use his last few bolt rounds and a satchel of scavenged C4 to collapse the entire structure, burying the rift under a mountain of rock. But the jungle itself was now their enemy. As they moved toward the site, vines thick as a man's arm lashed out, trying to drag them from the path. The ground pulsed with a sickening rhythm, and the whispers grew into a chorus of promises and threats. Waiting for them in the central chamber, bathed in the sickly purple light of the tear in reality, was something Chelius had not expected to face here, alone. It was 8 feet of knotted red muscle and brass-colored skin, a creature of pure murder holding a jagged blade that burned with otherworldly fire. A bloodletter of Khorne, the first true servant of chaos to set foot on Terra since the dawn of time. And it was smiling. The bloodletter stood in the sickly purple light, a creature of brass and murder, sculpted from the very essence of war. It was 8 feet of knotted red muscle, its skin gleaming like a freshly polished shell casing. In one hand, it held a hellblade, a jagged length of metal that did not reflect the light, but seemed to burn with it, radiating the pure, unthinking rage of a god not yet fully born into the human psyche. Chelius recognized it instantly. He had slain dozens of its kind in wars that spanned the galaxy, but to see one here, on this ancient Terra, was an abomination beyond words. The demon's gaze, burning coals in a horned skull, fixed on him. It sensed his nature, a warrior forged by the anathema, the golden tyrant who would one day deny chaos its birthright. It wanted his skull for its master's throne. The Marines reacted on instinct. M16s chattered, a hail of 5.56mm rounds peppering the demon's form. The bullets passed through its body as if through heat haze, leaving not a single mark. The creature didn't even flinch. This was not their fight. This was Chelius's purpose. "For the Emperor," he snarled, a phrase that had no meaning here, and fired his bolt pistol. The first mass-reactive shell struck the demon's chest, detonating with a concussive boom. Brass flesh tore, and ichor the color of crude oil sprayed onto the temple floor. The bloodletter staggered, roaring in surprise and pain. Chelius fired again and again, each round a thunderclap of defiance. But after the 4th shot, the demon was still standing, its wounds already knitting closed, its rage now focused and absolute. His chainsword was a useless weight on his back. He was left with his armor, his fists, and his hate. The duel was a grinding, brutal thing. The demon's hellblade swung in arcs that defied physics, and Chelius met them with his ceramite-plated forearms. Each impact sent shudders through his body, the otherworldly metal scoring deep gouges in armor forged to withstand plasma fire. Sparks flew, not from metal on metal, but from reality itself, tearing where the blade passed. Chelius's iron hands, the cybernetic replacements he'd earned in battles millennia ago, hammered at the demon's body, tearing away chunks of its brass flesh, only to see them reform an instant later. He was stronger than any mortal, faster than any machine, But the demon was a creature of the warp, tireless and eternal. The hellblade bit deep into his shoulder pauldron, slicing through ceramite and flesh. Blood, red and human, welled up. He was losing. Slowly, methodically, he was being dismantled. Private First Class Danny Reyes, the Catholic boy from a dusty Texas town, watched his brother die. Fear had frozen him, a cold dread that went deeper than any ambush or mortar strike. Then he remembered Callius's words from the bunker, translated by a trembling Okonkwo. Demons were not just flesh and blood. They were ideas. They were beings of emotion, of belief. They were vulnerable to faith as much as to weapons. Reyes had no bolter. He had something older. With a sob that was half prayer, he pulled the melted, blackened rosary from his neck. He charged. He wasn't a warrior. He was a terrified kid running toward the heart of all fear, screaming prayers in a language he barely understood, but had felt in his soul his entire life. Sancte Michael Arcangele, defende nos in proelio. The Latin, the true ancient Latin of the Church, that would one day evolve into the high Gothic of the Imperium, echoed in the corrupted chamber. The bloodletter turned, its snarling face twisting in what might have been amusement at the sight of this defiant insect. It raised a clawed hand to swat him aside. Reyes, his eyes squeezed shut, thrust the rosary forward. The lump of melted silver and plastic touched the demon's brass skin, and the demon burned. It shrieked, a sound of grinding metal and boiling blood, as the simple, pure faith of a single human soul acted like a white-hot brand against its warp-stuff essence. Its form flickered, its edges blurring like a bad photograph. It recoiled, its attention torn from Callius. That was the only opening the Iron Hand needed. With a guttural roar, Callius lunged. His iron fist, driven by the force of his transhuman musculature and 10,000 years of cold, unforgiving hatred, plunged through the demon's chest. He felt its essence, a burning, screaming knot of rage, and he closed his metal fingers around it. He tore it free. The bloodletter screamed a final silent note that vibrated across dimensions, and then its physical form discorporated, dissolving into a foul-smelling mist. It was banished, its connection to this world severed. It would remember. Khorne would remember. Reyes collapsed to his knees, his rosary a molten slag in his hand, his skin burned to the bone where he'd held it. He was smiling. With the demon banished back to the hell that spawned it, the sickly purple light in the chamber faded. But the air remained thick, charged with a lingering wrongness. Callius, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his armor a ruin of cracked ceramite, moved with the rigid purpose of a machine. The mission was not complete. He retrieved the satchels of scavenged C4 and began planting them at the structural anchor points of the Eldar device, his movements precise despite the agony. He set the timers, the digital displays a stark anachronism against the ancient stone. "Evacuate," he commanded, his voice a low growl through his Vox grill. "Now." Cole didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Reyes by the arm, hauling the dazed private to his feet. "Move! Everyone! Move!" But the temple, the corruption, would not let them go so easily. As they scrambled back through the Cyclopean corridors, the very architecture fought them. Warp-spawned vines, thick as pythons, lashed out from cracks in the walls, grabbing at their legs. Okonkwo hacked at one with his bayonet, the plant bleeding a foul-smelling ichor. The floor itself seemed to heave, the stone groaning like a dying beast. Private Martinez, bringing up the rear, let out a choked gasp. The men turned to see the floor beneath him simply vanish. opening into a pit of absolute silent darkness. There was no scream, no sound of impact, just a sudden, horrifying absence where a Marine had been a second before. They ran, fueled by terror. The rhythmic beeping from Callius's charges echoed behind them, counting down the final seconds. As the last of the squad, Cole and Okonkwo, burst from the temple entrance into the suffocating humidity of the jungle, they realized Callius was not with them. Cole turned, his heart seizing, and saw the giant warrior standing in the corridor, his massive frame a bulwark against the grasping tendrils and shifting stone. He held nothing but his own broken body, a shield of bleeding flesh and indomitable will, ensuring the passage remained open long enough for his brothers to escape. Then the world became light and sound. The explosives detonated in a chain reaction that tore the heart out of the mountain. From his position in the jungle, Cole was thrown from his feet as the ground bucked like a wild animal. He looked back to see the ancient temple implode, the mountain above it shattering and collapsing inward on itself. Millions of tons of rock, earth, and jungle plunged into the chasm, a geological hammer blow crushing the rift, the device, and the Space Marine who had made his stand. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain of falling debris. Then, an unnatural quiet fell. Cole watched, breathless, as the twisted trees surrounding the site seemed to sigh, their tortured branches straightening. The shadows, which had crawled with a life of their own, fell still. The air lost its foul taste. Whatever was leaking through had been sealed. An hour passed in stunned silence. Then the rubble stirred. For the second time in this war, Callius clawed his way out of a grave he should not have survived. A hand of fused, blackened metal broke the surface, followed by a helmet with a shattered eye lens. He dragged his body from the landslide, a thing of utter ruin. His armor was mangled beyond recognition. His multi-lung was audibly failing, pierced by 3 of his own ribs. The advanced clotting of his Laraman cells had been overwhelmed. He was slick with his own blood. He was, by any medical or biological standard, dying. Yet he walked. He found the huddled remains of his squad, took 3 steps toward them, and collapsed. He fell like a titan, shaking the very earth. Reyes and Okonkwo rushed to his side. Callius looked up at them, one red eye lens still glowing faintly. "The flesh is weak," he whispered, the words a strained rasp of broken Latin. He tried to say more, but his strength failed. Okonkwo knelt, tears streaming down his face as he translated for Cole. "But the spirit endures." Colonel West sent the choppers the moment Cole's emergency signal lit up the board at Firebase Cherokee. The medics who swarmed the landing zone were prepared for combat casualties. Not for this. As they cut away the shattered remnants of Callius's armor, they discovered an anatomy that defied all earthly biology. 2 hearts, both struggling to beat. 3 lungs, one of which was a mangled ruin. A secondary rib cage of fused bone, and a latticework of metallic reinforcement woven into his skeleton. They could do little more than apply pressure and pump him full of saline and morphine that his body barely registered. They were trying to patch a warship with canoe paddles. But Callius's own body was already at work. Deep within his cells, an ancient genetic legacy took over, clotting wounds that should have been fatal, fighting infections that would kill an entire platoon. It would take weeks, but he would heal. He always healed. He was Iron Hands. He was Space Marine. He endured. The war ground on, but its nature had changed. For 5 more years, until the American withdrawal in 1973, Callius remained. He became the quiet, terrifying center of Ghost Squad, a unit whose legend far outstripped its official record. As men died or rotated home, New volunteers, drawn by whispers of the impossible, would take their place. But the corps endured. Cole, the unshakable sergeant, Okonkwo, the scholar warrior, and Reyes, the boy whose faith had burned a demon. Together, they fought a war no one else knew existed. Their missions, logged as reconnaissance or interdiction, were often hunts. They sought out the lingering taint of the warp, small pockets of corruption where the jungle still twisted unnaturally, and purged them with fire and steel. They became the silent guardians of a seal on a world that did not know it was in peril. The day of the final withdrawal was one of organized chaos. The air at Firebase Cherokee was thick with the scream of Huey rotors and the smell of jet fuel. Men shouted farewells, their faces a mixture of relief and weary sorrow. Amidst the frantic exodus, Callias stood on the helipad, an island of stillness. His armor was a patchwork of scavenged plating and welded steel, the aquila on his chest scarred but still visible. Cole walked over to him, the rotor wash whipping at his fatigues. He didn't have to shout. The giant seemed to hear him over the din. "What will you do?" Cole asked, the question they had avoided for years. Callias had learned English, his speech forever marked by the formal archaic syntax of High Gothic. "I will wait," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked out at the scarred hills of Vietnam, then up at the indifferent sky. 38,000 years, perhaps longer, until the one who made me rises, until the Imperium I serve exists to serve. I will guard this world. I will protect humanity from what waits in the darkness. He turned his head, the single red eye lens focusing on the old sergeant. "And when my brothers come, I will greet them with a raised blade and 10,000 years of battle wisdom." Cole nodded slowly. He didn't understand it all, not really. But he understood duty. He understood the watch. He reached out and clasped the warrior's massive, rebuilt iron hand one last time. "Give 'em hell, Kay." A sound that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the Space Marine's lips. "I will give them war." The decades passed. The world changed. Wars came and went, flashes of fire on a globe he now observed with the patience of stone. He watched the Gulf War on a flickering television in a forgotten town. He saw the towers fall. He tracked the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. He did not join them. His war was older, and its enemy more patient. He guarded the sealed temple, now reclaimed by jungle so thick no path remained. He hunted the rare, twisted things that sometimes bubbled up through weak points in reality, eliminating them with cold, silent efficiency. He buried his brothers. In 2003, he stood in a quiet cemetery in Ohio, a towering, trench-coated figure watching as they lowered Marcus Cole into the earth. In 2011, he attended the funeral of James Okonkwo, a celebrated linguistics professor, and spoke a single line of High Gothic over the grave that made the other mourners stare. In 2019, he knelt beside the final resting place of Danny Reyes, a man who had become a deacon, his once burned hands long since healed. He was alone now, the last of Ghost Squad, a living memorial to a war fought in the shadows. But Space Marines are forged in loneliness. He endured. In the deep jungles of Vietnam, where he first awoke, his vigil continues. His armor, rebuilt 100 times with alloys and composites scavenged from the refuse of a world advancing toward its own unknowable future, still bears the two-headed eagle. He has learned to maintain his weapons, adapting, improvising, overcoming. His purpose is a cold, hard diamond in his soul. Sometimes, late at night, when the veil between worlds is thin, he can hear them. Faint echoes across the chasm of time. The thunder of bolters, the roar of drop pods, the war cries of his brothers, calling to him from a future that is his past. It is coming, inexorable, terrible, and his brother Sergeant Callius of the Iron Hands waits. He has time. Deep in a secure data vault, a modern intelligence satellite passes over Southeast Asia. Its sensors scan for heat, for movement, for anything out of the ordinary. The report is clean, just jungle. But an analyst, running an experimental deep tissue scan, flags an anomaly. He enhances the image, pixel by pixel, pushing past the canopy, into the deep shadows beneath ancient trees. For a flicker of a second, something registers. A reflection of metal where there should be leaves. A pinprick of crimson light where there should be only darkness. The jungle ghost still walks. The iron hand still guards. And, when the Emperor finally rises, 38 millennia from now, there will be one Marine waiting, ready to make his report. Terra held, my lord. The flesh was weak, but I endured.